Your note that sovereignty is under attack, but I wonder how we can both protest democracy at a local level and a national level, while at the same time promoting the need for effective international norms and institutions.
Well, when you're part of any system, whatever it is, a family, a country, a world, if you want to be part of it, you're making a compromise. You're giving up a certain degree of freedom of action because of the gains that come to you or to others, not just to you, from solidarity and participation. And the same is true of sovereignty. Like I said, national sovereignty is in itself is of no value. It's of value insofar as it contributes to human welfare, to human rights, to freedom, and so on. In this world, participation in an international community, which is a constructive and a healthy one, is good for everybody, not just us, but everyone else. So I don't see any contradiction between trying to maintain our control over our own polity, that is, in fact, trying to create control over it because we don't have much control over the way decisions are made within our own community, state, nation, and so on, and making the decision, our own decision, to subordinate some of those choices to international institutions, which can express a broader notion of solidarity and cooperation. I mean, there's no, these are like the kind of choices you make if you decide to live in a family and any bigger unit.
President Clinton recently said the U.S. has the right on humanitarian grounds to intervene with force in any country which it deems is abusing the human rights of its citizens. Do you agree with President Clinton's statement?
Well, it has interesting consequences. So, for example, I presume the U.S. Air Force has the capacity to bomb Washington. That was following. I'm most certainly following. And plenty of other places. So, I said I wouldn't go into this, but take, say, East Timor. There was never any intervention in East Timor, contrary to what you read. There was no intervention because there was no issue of sovereignty. Indonesian rights in East Timor were granted solely by the United States. It was an invasion. Indonesia invaded in 1975 with U.S. authorization. Security Council ordered them out. Actually, the U.S. voted for that, but undermined the Security Council resolution, and in fact the ambassador said so, explained why. Then came 25 years of huge massacres. Maybe a third of the population was wiped out with U.S. diplomatic and military support. In early 1999, the atrocities started escalating again. In the early months of the year, there were thousands of people killed by the Indonesian military and their paramilitary forces. This wasn't much reported here, but it wasn't very secret. This went on up to the point where, in September last year, 750,000 people, that's 85% of the population, were driven out of their homes. The country brutally driven out, most of the country destroyed. A couple 100,000 were driven into Indonesian territory. 150,000 are still there in Indonesian concentration camps. The U.S. did nothing. The U.S. position was, it's their responsibility, and we don't want to take it away from them. That was the position right through. Finally, in mid-September, Clinton was compelled, under domestic pressure and pretty heavy international pressure, primarily from Australia, to tell the Indonesian generals that the game was over. Okay, that's essentially what happened. He said, look, enough. Immediately they left. That tells you exactly how much latent power was always there. It wasn't necessary to bomb Washington to stop this atrocity, or to bomb Jakarta, or to impose sanctions. It was enough to withdraw participation, okay, and tell them it's finished. They left. After they left, a UN peacekeeping force entered, and the United States wants it to be reduced and refuses to fund it, and so on and so forth. And is, of course, doing nothing about those who right now are rotting in concentration camps. That's not intervention, and it's not humanitarian intervention. And there are many cases like that. If we want to do good in the world, the best place to start is with the famous Hippocratic principle. First, do no harm. So you want to stop. First thing to do is stop carrying out atrocities. And we're not doing that. While Clinton is talking about the right of humanitarian intervention, which he has never once exercised, and I want to cut down the criticism of Clinton, nor has anyone else. It's unlikely that in all of history you can find a genuine case of humanitarian intervention. Try. It's very hard. I mean, human intervention that was carried out with the intent with a humanitarian purpose. And occasionally they have humanitarian effects, which are incidental. And of course, just about every intervention is declared to be humanitarian. Hitler, Mussolini, everybody. But real ones, real humanitarian intent, that's extremely hard to find. There may not be any examples, so Clinton's not unusual. But there are many ways in which we can act to improve things in the world. For example, the easiest way is by not participating and escalating atrocities. And right now we're doing it right now. We're not talking about the past, not last year, next year. So one of Clinton's main projects for next year is a huge increase in military aid to Colombia. Colombia has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere and has had it for the last 10 years, mostly because human rights violations in our other client states declined, so it went up. It's also been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training during that decade, going on right under Clinton. Now it's going to go up even further. The military aid is designated. Notice that Colombia has now replaced Turkey at the top of the recipients of U.S. military aid. Actually, there's another category, Israel and Egypt, but that's a separate category for totally other reasons. But among the countries that get military aid, Turkey was top until this year. Now Colombia's moved to the top. The reason is that Turkey was carrying out a murderous, brutal counterinsurgency program and ethnic cleansing operation, which led to about, notice this is within NATO, it's not across the borders, which led to about 2 to 3 million refugees, 3,500 towns destroyed, that's about 7 times Kosovo, tens of thousands of people killed. How are they doing it? Well, with U.S. military aid that the Clinton administration was pouring in. As the atrocities escalated, the aid escalated. A lot of it illegal because it was banned by Congress, so it had to be done in devious ways, like jet planes and so on. Why has that declined? Well, because they pretty much suppressed the indigenous population that they were attacking. So therefore the aid has declined. Now it's shifting over to Colombia, where they still have that problem. About 80% of the atrocities, several thousand killed a year, are attributed even by the State Department to the paramilitaries who are tightly linked with the military. The aid is going to exactly those people. It's being directed for a counterinsurgency war. It's going to attack peasants. It's avoiding the areas of paramilitary control, even though everybody knows that the paramilitaries are up to their neck in narco-trafficking, just as the military is. All of this is under the cover of a drug war, which nobody takes seriously who knows anything about either Colombia or drugs. Okay, that's going to escalate atrocities. That's very likely going to escalate what is already the worst level of human rights violations in the hemisphere to something even higher. Okay, you want to stop... before talking about the academic issue of humanitarian intervention, of which there are no known examples, you can start by not escalating atrocities as you have been doing in the past. So instead of continuing to escalate atrocities, say in Turkey and give a long list of others, don't do it in Colombia and plenty of other places. So there's a lot that can be done. It's not that there's nothing that can be done, but you have to be serious about it.
Thank you. Without having looked at the questions, I know that there are many people in the audience that would like to have your impressions of what happened in Seattle and in terms of its prognosis for social activism.
Seattle was very significant, I think. For one thing, those people didn't just show up spontaneously. They were there because of very serious, extensive, long-term educational and organizing activities. And they show what can be achieved by that. And that's the only thing that can achieve anything. That's the first lesson that ought to be drawn from it. Educational and organizing activities can have a real effect, a very constructive effect. The other striking fact about Seattle, very striking, was the range of the diversity of the constituencies that were involved. I mean, they ranged from people speaking for indigenous people of the third world peasant and labor groups, U.S. labor, environmentalists in the United States and abroad. In fact, a very wide range of activists who people in the past haven't had much to say to one another or have even been antagonistic. But here they found common ground, an important common ground, in opposing a major attack on popular sovereignty and human rights and freedom that's going on under the rubric of these investor rights agreements. Well, what's the prognosis? Well, like everything else, depends what you make of it. You can't. There's no way to predict those things. These are things you try to do something about, not make predictions about. The predictions are idle. The actions that can be undertaken are very real. This is going to come up again the Boston Globe, my local newspaper, had a little item the other day that said, anarchists planning to attack IMF meeting. The anarchists are, those people, you know who they were. That's the way it must look from the centers of power. And there's something right about it. I mean, if you're trying to undermine authority and subordination and domination and so on, then you're in the highest principles of anarchism. So it's not totally false. But whether the anarchists, in quote, will succeed in compelling the IMF and the World Bank to reverse course or modify them substantially and to move the international order in totally different directions, those are questions of choice, not prediction.
Thank you. Kosovo. What are the interests driving intervention? What do you foresee for the people of the region? And before he answers that question, the book that he's autographed, you've heard the expression, read the book. The book he's autographed out front called The New Military Humanism, Lessons from Kosovo. It's Dr. Chomsky's latest book.
That one was written around last July. And since then, a lot of documentation has come out from impeccable sources like the State Department and NATO and so on, which affirms to an extent that actually surprises me the rather tentative conclusions there. I've written more recent stuff about it if you're interested. But we can start by saying what the intervention was not motivated by. It was not motivated by humanitarian concern. I think that is overwhelmingly obvious at this point. There is now a rich mine of documentation from sources of the kind I just mentioned, which demonstrate that up until the bombing, Kosovo was a pretty ugly place. In fact, not unlike Colombia, though probably not as bad. But nothing special was happening. The place was teeming with monitors, European monitors, the international human rights organizations, the ICRC, the UNHCR, and so on. And their reports are available to a large extent, and they're pretty clear. In the last reporting period, the two-month reporting period before the bombing, they estimate about one violent death a day, which is bad, on both sides, incidentally. These are distributed. Serbs, Albanians, some of the Albanians being killed by Albanians. Ugly, but not changing, and in fact, nothing special happening. The bombing was then undertaken with the expectation that it was going to sharply escalate atrocities. We now have a record of where it escalated atrocities from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and what it's called. What's the C? Forgotten, in Europe, the Europeans basically, who gave a detailed, detailed documentation of what happened afterwards, their conclusion is that the atrocities took place as anticipated, primarily in areas of guerrilla activity and potential invasion routes. Well, ugly and horrible and war crimes and everything else, but not all that surprising when you bomb some country and you threaten to invade them. That was the anticipated consequence of the bombing. It's been kind of inverted now in the rendition. So what you read is they were carrying out ethnic cleansing, so we had to bomb to stop ethnic cleansing. Just take a look at the record. It's exactly the other way around. The ethnic cleansing followed the bombing, and it was the anticipated consequence of it, and for ugly but intelligible reasons. You might ask yourself what would be happening here, let's say, if a guerrilla army based in Mexico were killing policemen, post-civil servants, civilians, and so on, with supplies coming in from Mexico in an effort to try to recover for Mexico the territory that was stolen from it not a lot long ago. How would you react around here? How would the United States react? Well, don't have to bother saying. The commander, General Clark, what he said at the time turns out to be very accurate. As the bombing started, the NATO commander Wesley Clark informed the press that it was entirely predictable that atrocities would sharply increase. We now know how sharply they increased because we know what they were before and what they were afterwards. A couple of weeks later, he informed the press again that the purpose of the bombing never had anything to do with ethnic cleansing. That was not a concern of the political leadership or of the military command that was implementing it. Okay, now in retrospect, that's pretty much what is the case. So I think we can wipe out that argument that it was humanitarian in intent for the first time in history. It wasn't. So what was it? That's the question. Well, here we go from fact, which you can verify, to speculation, which you can only just guess, because we don't have internal documents. So if you want my speculation, it's about what I had in that book. I think there's now more evidence for it, but it's still speculation, because we don't have documents of internal planning. If you take a look back at that time, you'll notice that two arguments were given for the bombing. The first argument was we had to stop ethnic cleansing, but that can't possibly be right. Just take a look at the factual record. The second argument that was given is more plausible, in my view, and that is it was necessary to maintain the credibility of NATO. Well, I think that's plausible, but you have to translate it. Like most things in political rhetoric, you've got to do a little work on it. When the U.S. and Britain talk about the credibility of NATO, what do they have in mind? I mean, are they worried about the credibility of Norway? Credibility of Italy? Belgium? I don't think so. They're worried about the credibility of the United States and its attack dog, which is what England has become. As basically as a highly militarized state that's kind of send out to attack people. So the U.S. and its attack dog, it's their credibility that's at stake. Well, with whom? Well, wide audience. For one thing, with Europe. Part of the reason, I suspect, for shifting the arena of confrontation from diplomacy to violence is that that's where the U.S. and Britain reign supreme. If you can bring NATO in, it's a U.S., secondarily British operation. If it's a matter of diplomacy, the United States doesn't hold any cards any stronger than Germany or France or anyone else. There's been a significant conflict between Europe and the United States over the emerging shape of the world. They don't agree on everything. They disagree on things. Putting NATO in the forefront is a way of putting the United States in the forefront. The United States doesn't dominate, Europe, but it does dominate NATO. If Europe were to move towards a security system from, say, the Atlantic to the Urals, the way France and some in Germany have proposed, that's going to marginalize the United States in European affairs. if Europe stays under NATO control, the U.S. is going to run it. That's NATO expansion and everything else. So part of the credibility that was involved, I think, was credibility of U.S. power vis-a-vis Europe. But then it's much broader than that. I mean, Serbia, like it or hate it, it's the one part of Europe which has not subordinated itself to the U.S. sort of picture of what things should look like. And it's got to go. And if it turns out to be disobeying orders as it was doing, then all the more reason why it's got to go. Here, credibility in another sense enters. If you want to understand that form of credibility, just go to your favorite mafia don and ask him what credibility means. If a local storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, you don't just send somebody to collect the money, right? You make an example of him because you have to establish credibility. You send in goons and beat them to a pulp or, something like that. That establishes credibility. Then others understand they better listen. Okay, that's credibility. And if you look through the record, that's the kind of credibility that has to be established all the time. Not just by the mafia don, but by the global mafia don as well, whoever it may be. And in the last half century, it's been mostly the United States. Now, dramatically. Well, I think that's a sense in which credibility had to be established. You have to show who's boss. You have to domesticate aspirations, like the Jesuits in San Salvador learned, the surviving ones, because aspirations contrary to the wishes of the powerful will not be tolerated, and efforts to pursue them will lead to very severe consequences. Well, I think this shows that. My guess is that range of considerations is probably what underlies planning in this case as in many others. But let me say again, that's speculation. Till the documentary record may come out, long after I'm gone, we're not going to have any clear evidence about this, I expect.
Dr. Chomsky, there have been several questions about the Internet, and if you might comment on your thoughts about its impact on wealth distribution, capital mobility, and its potential to alter the status quo.
Well, remember first, something important, I'm sure you know, but it's important to bear in mind. Like just about every dynamic aspect of the economy, the Internet is a product of the state sector. That is, it was created at public expense. It was within the vast state sector of the economy for around 30 years. First the Pentagon, then the National Science Foundation. That's where the ideas came, the development, the research, meaning the public paid for it. Maybe the public didn't know, but the public paid for it. And that went on until very recently. The Internet was handed over to private power only in 1995. It was a gift, a huge gift from the public, which didn't know a thing about it, to private power. That certainly didn't have to happen. In fact, an interesting question is how it happened, and nobody's been able to figure that out yet. There is no record that anybody can discern of what the decision-making process was by which you guys, the public, handed over to Bill Gates and others this tremendous development. It's by no means the only thing. I mean, most of the dynamic economy is sort of similar. This is a dramatic case of it. Norman Solomon is a media critic. You may know, made the interesting observation. He studied some media reports that before and after 1995, the Internet was differently described in the media. Before 1995, it was described usually as an information superhighway. Since 1995, it's been described mostly as e-commerce, home marketing service. Well, that's not accidental. When it was under public control, the goal was, or at least, thought to be an information superhighway, something that people could participate in. Now it's a technique of subordination. It's being converted into a device of exactly the kind that I was describing from the advertising industry going back, decades. A device to degrade and control people, to create wants, to impose a philosophy of futility, to focus your attention on the superficial aspects of life, like fashionable consumption, and to marginalize people, keep them from the dangerous activity of interacting with one another, and just satisfy created wants. Will it be that? Well, it's kind of like the question about Seattle. It depends whether people let it happen. That's a terrain of struggle right now. The Internet has been very effective in organizing. It's had a very valuable subversive effect, like Seattle, for instance. A lot of the organizing was through Internet. Or East Timor. I've been working on East Timor for years, ever since mid-'70s. Almost got nowhere until the early 90s, when Charlie Shiner came along and organized ETAN, the East Timor Action Network, largely through the Internet. Well, within a very short time, there was pretty active and effective lobbying efforts and educational and organizing efforts, which made a big difference. It was, that's the kind of thing you can do with it. The multilateral agreement on investments, that would have sailed right through if it hadn't been for Internet organizing, which got around the media suppression on the issue very quickly, in fact. Same is true in other countries, like in Indonesia. The overthrow of the Suharto dictatorship was substantially done through the Internet. It's a technique of communication that went around the main control systems. Well, that's just what the major corporations want to stop. They want to stop that kind of freedom. And that's just what the public ought to be calling for and trying to maintain. And that's a big battle that's going to go on in the next couple of years. And it's like everything else. You can't predict the outcome. It's the kind of thing you try to do something about rather than try to predict. So the future of the Internet is very much up for grabs, I think.
Dr. Chomsky, could you comment on the implications, the extent of, and the consequences of corporate participation in the U.S. system of higher education?
Yeah, that's a very, very real issue. I mean, there's been a general assault in the last 25 years on solidarity, democracy, social welfare, anything that interferes with private power. And there are many targets. One of the targets is undoubtedly the educational system. In fact, a couple of years ago already, the big investment firms like, Lehman Brothers and so on were sending around brochures to their clients saying, look, we've taken over the health system, we're taking over the prison system. The next big target is the educational system. So we can privatize the educational system, make a lot of money out of it, and also notice that privatizing it undermines the dangerous, this kind of a ethic that has to be undermined, namely the idea that you care about somebody else. In a public education system is based on the principle that you care whether the kid down the street gets an education. And that's got to be stopped. What you have to do is exactly, and this is very much like what the workers in the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts were worrying about 150 years ago. They were trying to stop the idea that what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. We want to stop that. That's not what we're like. We're human beings. We care about other people. We want to do things together. We care about whether the kid down the street gets an education. We care about whether somebody else has a road, even if I don't use it. We care about whether there's a child slave laborer in Thailand. We care about whether somebody else, some elderly person, gets food. That's Social Security. You care whether somebody else gets food. All of that, there's a huge effort to try to undermine all of that, to try to privatize aspirations, so then you're totally controlled. Privatize aspirations, you're completely controlled. Private power goes its own way. Everyone else has subordinated themselves to it. Well, that's part of the basis for the attack on the public education system, and it goes right up to the universities. In the universities, there's a move towards corporatization, and that has very clear effects. I mean, you see it at MIT, you see it everywhere. it means that you want to create just like industry, you want to create a more flexible workforce. That means undermine security. It means have cheap temporary labor, okay, like graduate students, who don't have to be paid much and who can be thrown out. They're temps. Okay, they're going to be around for a couple of years, and then you toss them out and have some more temps. It affects research, strikingly. You see it at research. I'm sure you see it here, but at a research institute like where I am, MIT, you see it pretty clearly. As funding shifts from public entities, including, incidentally, the Pentagon, in fact, primarily the Pentagon, which has long understood that its domestic role is to be a cover for transferring public funds into private profit. When funding goes from the Pentagon and the National Science Foundation and others into corporate funding, there's a definite shift. A corporation, say, some pharmaceutical corporation, is not particularly likely to want to fund research which is going to help everybody. Okay, it's not going to want to. There's exceptions, but by and large, it's not going to want to fund, say, basic biology, which may be a public good that anybody can use 10 or 20 years from now. It's going to want to fund things that it can make profit from, and furthermore, do it in the short term. So there's a tendency, a striking tendency, and a perfectly natural one, for corporate funding to institute more secrecy and short-term applied projects to which the corporation has a proprietary control on publication and use. Well, technically, a corporate funding can't demand secrecy, but that's only technically. In fact, they can. Like the threat of not refunding imposes secrecy. There are actually cases like this, some of them so dramatic they even made the Wall Street Journal. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal last summer, you may have seen, about MIT, my place. What had happened was that a student in a class, computer science class, had refused to answer a question on an exam. He said he knew that when he was asked why by the professor, he said, well, he knew the answer, but he was under a secrecy condition from a different professor not to answer it. And the reason was, in the research he was doing for this other professor, they had sort of worked out the answer to this, but they wanted to keep it secret because they wanted to, make money or something. Well, this is so scandalous. Even the Wall Street Journal was scandalized. But that's the kind of thing that's the kind of thing you can expect, as there's a move towards corporatization. After all, corporations, they are not benevolent societies. As Milton Friedman correctly says, the board of directors of a corporation actually has a legal obligation to be a monster, an ethical monster. Their legal obligation is to maximize profit for the shareholders, the stockholders. They're not supposed to do nice things. If they are, it's probably illegal. Unless it's intended for some, to mollify people or something, improve market share or something. And that's the way it works. You don't expect corporations to be benevolent any more than you expect dictatorships to be benevolent. Maybe you can force them to be benevolent, but it's the structure it's the tyrannical structure that's the problem. And as the universities move towards corporatization, you expect all of these effects. And one of the effects, in a way I think the most important, is the undermining of the conception of solidarity and cooperation. And I think that lies at the heart of the attack on the public school system, on the attack on Social Security, the effort to block any form of national health care, which has been going on for years, and in fact across the board. And it's understandable. If you want to regiment the minds of men just the way an army regiments its body, you've got to undermine these subversive notions of mutual support, solidarity, sympathy, caring for other people, and so on and so forth. The attack on public education is one example. Incidentally, I don't know how it's working here, but in Massachusetts, where I see it directly, it's not. There's a comparable attack on the state colleges. The state colleges, which sort of they're for the for working class people. People come back to college after They're halfway in their career, mothers who come back, people from the urban ghettos, and so on and so forth. That's what the state college system has been. And they're under serious attack by an interesting method. The method has been to raise the entrance standards for the state colleges without improving the schools. Okay. So when you don't improve the schools, but you raise the entrance standards for the people who are trying to go on, kind of obvious what happens, you get lower enrollments. When you get lower enrollments, you got to cut staff. Because remember, we have to be efficient like corporations. So you cut staff and you cut services, and then you can admit even fewer people, and there's kind of a natural cycle. And you can see where it ends up. It ends up with people either not going to college or figuring out some way to spend $30,000 a year at a private college. And you know what that means. All of these are comparable efforts, are part of the general effort, I think, to create a socioeconomic order which is under the control of private concentrated power. Shows up all over the place.
Dr. Chomsky, could you comment on socially responsible investing? Is it a viable option for positive change, or is it a way to depoliticize people?
Well, I don't think it's a bad thing to do. It's like asking dictators to be more benevolent, which is often a good thing to do. Like it's better if you have a dictator, it's better if they're benevolent than if they torture people. And that can change, like a slave owner. It's better to have a nice slave owner than a murderous slave owner. And I think those are good things to do. I think it makes a lot of sense to take illegitimate institutions and try to make them function less harmfully to people. Whether it depoliticizes you or not depends on whether you decide to mislead yourself. That's a choice. It can depoliticize you if you think you're doing something different. But if you see that this is in fact what you're doing, then it's a good thing to do.
What are the motivations of the U.S. push for sustainable development in the developing world?
It's the first time I ever heard of it. Does the U.S. have a push for sustainable development? As far as I know, the U.S. push is for unsustainable non-development, almost the opposite. I mean, the programs that are built into... Take a look at the World Trade Organization rules, like, TRIPS and TRIMS, for those of you who know this stuff, trade-related investment, intellectual property, and trade-related investment measures. Okay, both of those are designed to impede development and impede growth. So the intellectual property rights are just protection of, monopolistic, of control, guaranteeing that corporations, in fact, by now mega corporations, have the right to charge monopolistic prices. So guaranteeing, say, that pharmaceutical production, drugs, will be priced, at a level at which most of the world can't afford them, even people here. Like, for example, drugs in the United States are much more expensive than the same drug as close as Canada, even more expensive than, say, Europe. And for the third world, this just dooms tens of millions of people to death. Now, as I said, other countries can produce the drugs. Under the earlier patent regimes, what you had was process patents. I mean, I don't even know if those are legitimate, but process patents meant that if, say, some pharmaceutical company figured out a way to produce a drug, somebody smarter could figure out a better way to produce it. Okay, because all that was patented was the process. So, like, if the Brazilian pharmaceutical industry figured out a way to make it cheaper and better, fine, they could do it. Wouldn't violate patents. The World Trade Organization regime insists on product patents. So you can't figure out a smarter process. Notice that impedes growth and development as it's intended to. It's intended to cut back innovation, growth, and development, and to maintain extremely high profits. Well, the pharmaceutical corporations and others claim they need this for research and development, but have a close look. It's been looked at. A lot of these, there's a very substantial part of the research and development is paid for by the public anyway. in a narrow sense, it's on the order of 40 to 50%, but that's an underestimate because it doesn't count the basic biology and the basic science, which is all publicly funded. So if you get a realistic amount, it's a very high percentage is publicly paid anyway. Well, suppose that went to 100%. Okay, then all the motivation for monopolistic pricing would be gone, and there'd be a huge welfare benefit to it. There's no economic motive for this. I mean, there's an economic motive, profit, but there's no, it is not. It is an effort to impede growth and development. But what about trade-related investment measures? What do they do? It's a little more subtle than that. In this case, it's straightforward. It's straight protectionism for the benefit of the rich and powerful, publicly subsidized corporations. TRIMs, the trade-related investment measures, are a little more subtle. What they require is that a country cannot impose conditions on what an investor decides to do. Like if an investor, say, decides to, suppose General Motors, let's say, decides to carry out outsourcing, to have parts made in some other country and, non-union labor, cheap labor, and then send them back to General Motors. Well, in the successful developing countries in Asia, one of the ways they developed was by blocking that sort of thing, by insisting that if there was foreign investment, it had to be done in a way which was productive for the receiving country. So like there had to be technology transfer, or you had to invest in places they wanted you to invest in, or there had to be some proportion of the investment had to be for export that, of finished goods that made money. Lots of devices like that. That's part of the way in which the East Asian, economic miracle took place. Incidentally, it's the way that all the other developing countries developed too, including the United States, with technology transfer from England and so on and so forth. Those things are blocked by the trade-related investment measures. Superficially, they sound like they're increasing free trade, but what they're in fact increasing is the capacity of huge corporations to carry out central management of cross-border transactions, because that's what outsourcing is, centrally managed. It's not trade in any meaningful sense. So they again undermine growth and development. In fact, you look across the board, and what's being instituted is a regime which will prevent the kind of development that has taken place in the countries that today are rich industrial countries. But you go back from England to the United States to Germany to France, Japan, Korea, every one of these countries developed by violating the principles that are now being built into the World Trade Organization and radically violating them. Okay, these are methods of undermining growth and development and ensuring concentration of power. So, and the issue of sustainable development doesn't even arise. That's another question altogether. Sustainable development means, for example, paying attention to what are called externalities, the things economists don't look at. So take, say, trade. In a certain trade is supposed to increase, wealth or something. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but you don't know what it does until you count in the costs of trade, including costs which are not counted. Like, for example, the cost of pollution. Say, when something moves from here to there, it's creating pollution. It's called an externality. You don't count it. There's resource depletion, like you deplete the resources of agricultural production. There's military costs. So, for example, the price of oil is kept within a certain band, not too high, not too low, by a substantial part of the Pentagon. Very substantial part of the Pentagon is directed towards the Middle East oil producers, not because the United States likes desert training or something, but because that's where the oil is. You want to make sure that it doesn't get too high and doesn't get too low. It stays where you want it. There haven't been much investigation of this, but one investigation by the U.S. Energy Department estimated that Pentagon expenses alone amount to maybe 30% subsidy to the price of oil, something maybe in that range. Well, you look across the board, there's lots of things like this. I mean, the trade has, one of the costs of trade is that it drives people out of their livelihoods. So when you export subsidized U.S. agricultural products to Mexico, it drives millions of peasants out of farming. Okay, that's a cost, you know. In fact, it's a multiple cost because those millions of people not only suffer, but they are driven into the cities where they lower wages. So other people suffer, including, incidentally, American workers who now are competing with even lower paid wages. Well, you know, these are costs. If you take them into account, you get a totally different picture of you know, economic interactions entirely. And so that's also true just of something like gross domestic product. You take a look at the measures of gross domestic product, and they're highly ideological. I mean, for example, one of the ways to increase the gross domestic product in the United States is to do what, in fact, is doing, not repair roads. If you don't repair roads, and you have a lot of potholes all over the place, that means when cars drive, they get smashed up, and that means you got to buy a new car, or you have to go to a mechanic and get them to fix it, and so on. All of that increases the gross domestic product. Okay, you make people sicker, you know, by polluting the atmosphere. That increases the gross domestic product because they have to go to the hospital and you have to pay doctors and you have to have drugs and so on. In fact, what increases the gross domestic product has almost nothing to do with wealth. I mean, something, but it's not a measure of, you know, welfare in any meaningful sense. There have been efforts to construct other measures which do take account of these things, and they give you very different stories. I'll just give you one source to look at if you're interested. The United States is one of the, maybe the only industrial country anyway, one of the few that does not publish regular what are called social indicators, like measures of social welfare, you know, child abuse, mortality, all kinds of things. Most countries do it. Every year they have a social indicator measure. The United States doesn't, so it's kind of hard to get a measure of the social health of the country. But there have been efforts to do it. There's one major project at Fordham University, Jesuit University in New York. For years, they've been trying to construct a social health measure for the United States. They just came out a couple of months ago with the last volume. And it's interesting stuff. According to their analyses of, you know, the kinds of measures of the sort I mentioned, you know, it turned up until about 1975, that is through, you know, the golden age, as it's called, social health went up more or less with the economy. You know, so it kind of tracked the economy. As that got better, social health got better. From 1975, they've diverged. The economy has continued to grow, even though more slowly than before, but social health has declined. You know. And in fact, they conclude that, and it's continuing to decline, they conclude that the United States is in a recession, serious recession, from the point of view of measures that matter. You know. Well, that's when you're beginning to look at questions like, you know, sustainable development, meaningful development. But that requires a completely different perspective on, you know, all of these issues of economy and consequences and so on. One that definitely should be undertaken. And those are the issues that arise when people are talking about sustainable development. But the U.S. certainly has no such program. Should, but doesn't. Yeah.
We had wanted tonight to be a celebration of activism, and I think that this turnout is a good indication that it is just that. Many people have traveled a long ways to come here. I want to acknowledge that there are about 60 students and faculty from the United World College. They're students from around the world who have traveled 250 miles tonight by the time they go and come back to their schools. There were a lot of questions about what the individual can do and what society can do to respond positively and productively to the kind of monopolization of power that we're seeing. But rather than ask that question, Dr. Chomsky continues on a schedule like this, week after week, year after year. He was booked 18 months in advance when we tried to first ask him to join us for the celebration. This is actually the 21st year of IRC. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary late because we want to celebrate it with Dr. Chomsky. But I would like to close by asking him, what is it that sustains him, and what is it that gives him hope, and what is it that inspires him to keep on going like he's been doing for so many years?
Well, it's easy. It's groups like IRC who do the real work. I mean, the really important work is done by people who are at it day after day, whatever the activity is. And there are plenty of them, most of them unknown. I mean, you look over past history, the people who have really changed the world in a decent direction, nobody knows their names. Take, say, the civil rights movement in the United States. How many of you know the names of the people who actually were at the forefront, like snake workers? Nobody knows their names. Few, maybe. That kind of dedication, energy, activism everywhere. It's, if anybody has an opportunity to participate in it now and then, it's a gift. Thank you.
You've been listening to a live broadcast of Noam Chomsky from the Albuquerque Convention Center. Dr. Chomsky is now receiving a standing ovation from the approximately 2,500 people in attendance here at the Convention Center.